Thank you for inviting me here. I attended the first ASPO meeting in 2002. We could not have been more than 50 people, and we fitted into a classroom at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. Coming back from Uppsala, I had a meeting with high-ranking Norwegian civil servants in the oil ministry and telling them about peak oil and the perils, and their attitude was, peak oil? Isn't that just for nutty professors? That is something we have to care about. And funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a radio debate with the Norwegian Minister of Energy, and he still maintained that position. It is truly amazing to see how the growth and interest and focus on the subject of peak oil has grown over the years. Slowly, people and even organizations who has been adamantly opposed to the concept has now turned around and seen the light and become believers. Hence the title of the talk. My comments will be mostly on the IEA, and they seem to have become believers. But on the way, they have done some damage. The first time I started noticing the IEA was after they issued the GOOP report in 1995. The GOOP report stands for Global Offshore Oil Production Prospects. Matt Simmons put his teeth into the report and he was not impressed. He wrote an internal report on it, and the IEA was suddenly on my radar screen. It's 150 pages long, listing numerous fields. The main theme was technology was the game changer. Depletion is hardly mentioned. From 1995 to 2000, offshore production was going to grow with 6.3 million barrels per day. It grew with only 3.5 million barrels. In honesty, was there any impact of the price crash? I gather not, since it happened in 98 and 99, and offshore production fields has a long lead time, so I don't think it had much impact. Next round was the missing barrels. In Table 1 in the monthly oil market report, the IEA have a line called miscellaneous to balance. Here you have stock build outside the OECD and all the other things that the IEA cannot explain. Through 1998, the supply and demand figures started to drift apart, making this miscellaneous to balance bigger and bigger. This is what the world looked like to an oil trader in March of 1999. For 1997, there were 500,000 barrels a day missing. In 1998, 1.1 million barrels a day missing. If you allowed 100,000 barrels a day for stock build outside OECD, you still had 500 million barrels a day, 500 million barrels in total, which was missing. Apparently hiding somewhere, waiting to attack the market. The first idea they had was that it was loaded in tankers, slowly steaming around in the world. Since I've spent a fair amount of years in the tanker business, I made some simple calculations, sent an email to David Knapp, and explained why that could only explain 10% of the 500 million, even in the worst of circumstances. Then they came up with salt caverns in Sweden, or strategic stocks in South Africa. Well, they never managed to explain the missing barrels, and if you compare, the US crude tank farms are under 160 million barrels in total. Now, where on earth would you keep 500 million barrels? And they've never, ever admitted that they were just totally wrong. So how much was the IEA contributing to sending the oil price to $10 a barrel? Then I started following how wrong they were in their non-OPEC ex-FSU predictions. Every year in June, they come up with a forecast for next year. And I made a little spreadsheet looking like this. In 2003, the forecast was then from July 2002, they were 100,000 barrels wrong. Not much. 1994, it grew to 700. 1995, 900. Now it's starting to get serious. And by mid-year 2006, it was 1.1, and at the end of the year, it was 1.4. In August of 2006, David Fife visited Oslo to introduce the IEA's new 5-year forecast. And in his presentation, he did happen to mention that 2005 had been a bad year for their forecast, but that was just a 1 year off. On the Q&A, I got up and I just lined up these figures, and at that time, 2006 was at 1.1, and I said, it doesn't look like 2005 was a bad year off. It looks to me like a trend. He got a little bit upset and said that their model was nothing wrong with that, and I should just wait and see. During the fall, the oil would come rushing, and they would be vindicated. He must have had a pretty bad autumn that year, following month by month, seeing that the 1.1 grew to 1.4. 2007, so far, 1,150,000 barrels. Now, in 2007, they started finally to fess up to the problem. They must have been under an awful pressure. For year after year, having wrong forecasts. The issues they started addressing was first in March 2007, call on OPEC. They now introduced a so-called adjusted call, which took into consideration some of the things that were apparently wrong with their miscellaneous to balance. Then, in June, they discussed spare capacity, the difference between their allegedly spare capacity and real spare capacity. I'll get back to that. And then in June 2007, you had the interview with Fatih Birol, which has already been touched on. The first quote I thought I should use has already been given to you, and the next one I think is quite cute. He says, I understand the Saudi government claims 230 billion barrels of reserves, and I have no official reason not to believe these numbers. No official reason. So, I guess it's not only Colin Campbell who is skeptical about those reserve figures. And in July 2007, they got the second year 5-year outlook, and now they're saying that the unsustainable long-term demand growth is what they talk about. Now, the spare capacity issue in June of 2007, they say that the notional spare capacity is 4 million barrels a day, and that's what they read in their normal paper. That is what the media refers to as the spare capacity we have, no reason to worry. Then they say, let's take out Iraq, Venezuela, Nigeria, Indonesia. Doesn't seem like Iraq will come fully online within the next couple of months. So we pull out 1.1 million barrels a day. Then they say that, come on, that the effective spare capacity is 2.8 million barrels a day. And then they make this astonishing comment. Of the efficient spare capacity, 88% is heavy sour crude, about 2.5 million barrels a day. Are there any buyers? So this is oil nobody wants and you can't sell. Is that spare capacity? Real effective spare capacity, in other words, is 350,000 barrels a day. Now that figures more with what we can see in the marketplace. If you look at July 2006, I think we can all agree there was really no spare capacity. At that time, the official spare capacity was 3 million barrels a day. And if you do the same exercise and you pull out the 2.5, I put a question mark because who knows if it's exactly as much heavy sour crude 1 year ago as it is today, but let's say it's about the same, then you actually got a negative net spare capacity. Now, that's hard to have, but at least it shows that there was zero spare capacity at that time. If you use the same way of counting today in October, we are at 150,000 barrels a day. Bottom line is there is no spare capacity. But the IEA insisted until June in talking about it as if it existed. Now we come to the 5-year outlook, which I think is quite interesting. For the first time, they made the outlook in July 2006. Was there any reason to be worried? On the face of it, no. So the media and the policymakers were happy. If you discounted all their figures based on what we've seen, there were plenty to worry about. But then the last 12 months happened, and the IEA changed their tune. Now, these are the figures in their 2006 report. In 2007, these are the figures for global demand. And as you can see, they reduced a little this year, gone up later. And I think we can all agree that the demand figures for IEA is probably a bit aggressive, so maybe here they will come down. But then look at the non-OPEC supply. What happened between 2006, 2007, and this is the adjustment. The interesting thing is to look at 2007. They went down close to 1.3 million barrels a day, because that was the year that was so close it was hard to talk their way out of it. But it seems that from then on, there is no adjustments. They just reduced the baseline. So maybe we'll have some more surprises down the road when it comes to non-OPEC supply. OPEC crude capacity, these figures from 2006, these from 2007, this is the adjustment. Again, baseline reduced in 2007, but from there on, fairly insignificant adjustments to their forecasts. So maybe we'll have some surprises there as well. This is the adjusted call on OPEC. This is this year's figures, and the adjustment is the following. So we've now increased to 2010 with 1.3 million barrels a day. Now that's a fairly significant figure. But then you have the OPEC adjusted spare capacity. This is when it's getting interesting. This is this 2007 report. As long as you could talk about 4 to 5 million barrels a day, who cared? At least not the media and no politicians. But the adjustment in 1 year is actually quite staggering. And look at 2012, we're down to 2.1 million barrels a day. And then, if I may remind you about the spare capacity, you have to deduct this in order to get the real spare capacity. So then what happens? Now I've deducted 2.5 million barrels a day, and we have 0 spare capacity today, and it's fairly flat going on and negative in 2012. Now, no wonder Fatih Birol is losing sleep. The sum of the politics and heavy oil, and in the earlier slide, was 3.5 million barrels a day, so why am I not deducting that? Well, it's hard to answer. It's said that the crude stream is getting slightly lighter and sweeter in the short term. Maybe we'll have some more refining capacity, but mostly, I must admit, it's because I shy away from negative spare capacity over a long year period of time. It just doesn't add up that we now have negative spare capacity in 2007. But that is not the point. We must not become slaves of uncertain numbers. The point is, we have way less spare capacity than we are led to believe. So when the media talks about millions of spare capacity, in reality, we have none. And that's the main point. Let me then say a few words about the IFP, the French Petroleum Institute. I understand that the French are not popular in the US, I've gathered. Even French fries have been renamed. But let that not taint the IFP. IFP is a research institution in an economy which is very different from the American. In France, business, government, and research is closely interlinked. The people who are running the IFP are therefore both scientists and civil servants with close ties to business, and they do not cry in the wilderness. They have a direct impact through their channels. A man like the leader of the IFP, Olivier Appert, sits on several boards and comes from the same group of people that govern France. Therefore, IFP will never shout, but they will whisper, and when they do, you better listen. Their models are proper research, and they all have expertise in geology and engineering to do all their analysis, because they're also an educational institution, the Petroleum Institute of France. Unlike some organizations which makes forecasts where the economists use the same models for oil as for toothpaste. Last year, the IFP made a presentation from which I've taken one slide. It is in French, but maybe we can decipher it. Yeah, it is hard. I think the main point of the slide is that looked from a purely geological point of view, they gather that peak oil should be in 2028, let's say 25 to 30, due to political, technical, economical limitations, be it rigs, people, whatever. They say it will be reduced, it will come earlier. Last year, they made a presentation where their base case was that we would max out production at about 100 million barrels a day in liquids, and that would be around 2015. In June of this year, a group of us paid a visit to the IFP, and we discussed their peak oil view. They stressed that they believe in a plateau, not a peak. They also told us that their findings of last year was being revised, but the study was not completed. However, the direction of their view, as compared with last year, was that the level of the plateau was moving in the direction of 95 million barrels per day, and that the time that this would happen was also moving in the direction of 2010. However, they stressed the uncertainties and the importance of various above-ground challenges to flow rate. They also made another interesting observation. When they meet with technical specialists in Shell, BP, and Exxon, for that matter, there is, to a large degree, consensus about the facts. But it seems, however, that it's on its way from the specialists to the executive floor. The message gets lost. And when you hear the statements of Rex Tillersons of this world, it's a different message. One case like that must be BP. Anybody who thinks that an oil company really knows what they're doing should look at this slide, which has been put together with the good help of Simmons and Company research team. What they've done is that they've taken the various statements given by BP at their first quarterly press announcements, adjusted for acquisitions and divestitures, and then seen how have they performed compared with their promises. In 2000, they gave their promises indicated a production in 2007 of 6 million barrels a day. First quarter of 2004, this was reduced to 5 million barrels a day, and now we also see the production in 2006 as a forecast. This is on the first quarter of 2005. We see how the figures are slowly going down. This is the first quarter of 2006. Now the 6 million has become 4.3. And the first quarter of this year, you see 2006, which was originally 4.5 million, came in at 3.9, and 2007, which in 2000 should have been 6, came down at 3,850. Now you've lost 2.1 million barrels a day in production. Clearly, something is happening which is not totally understood, which actually was also the same answer I got from the head of E&P in North Sea of Norsk Hydro in January when the NPD drastically reduced their projections for the North Sea. I met him the day after and I said, what's going on? What's happening here? And he said, well, all our new projects are working fine. It's the damn decline rate in the old fields. We didn't figure with that. So it seems to be widely spread. Another issue I have with BP is the following. They have this show that travels around. I don't know if they come here, but they come to Norway every June to present their annual statistics. And everybody refers to BP statistics of world reserves. BP say this, BP say that. Has anybody read the disclaimer? The reserve figures shown do not necessarily meet SEC's definitions and guidelines in determining proved reserves, nor do they necessarily represent BP's view of proved reserves by country. Now, why on earth are they all the time being referred to as BP statistics of reserves? They should just say, we are just printing what we're given. I'm sorry, Jeremy, I know you're fond of BP. Now, we have another group of Euro-optimists, CGES. No, we did not run out of stones. Don't you also hate that phrase that was apparently coined by Yamane? But these guys hold on to one thing. Very soon, there will be a surplus of oil and prices will fall. They are changing their assumptions, but the conclusion is always the same. In January 2006, Leo Drollos paid a visit to Oslo. I got his slideshow. He was again here in September, and I compared the slides. As you will see, it is fascinating to see how quickly their assumptions are changing without changing the basic conclusion. There is nothing to worry about. But let's not discount what they're saying about demand. The IEA seems to be too aggressive, but on the other hand, what you will see about their view on demand would represent a watershed. Now, this is this year's slide on prices and spare capacity. As you can see, I had hoped that the figures would be more easily to see, but by the end of 2008, you can see prices are going down and spare capacity is going quite up. I think it ends up there at around 6%. I hoped I had a monitor here, but I don't. And this is on the fundamentals, the incremental oil demand. Look at the figure for 07 and not to talk about 08. And later, it's 400,000 barrels a day of demand growth in 08. And in 09 and 010 together, they have about less than 1 million barrels in further growth. So you're talking about 3 years with about 1.2 million barrels a day in incremental growth. That is dramatic. And if you compare this to the IEA figures, it's 1.2 in 2007 and 2.1 in 2008. Now, here is a slide from 2006, and this goes all the way to 2020. At the time, the oil price was $50, which according to them was going to be a peak. And you can see the price going down and then coming slightly up again towards 2020, while spare capacity was going up to 12% of global consumption. And I guess that's like close to 10 million barrels a day in spare capacity. And that was 18 months ago. Now, the spare capacity, you can see the oil price is up to 70, and then it's going down to about 50, and then back up again. And the spare capacity is now not going further up than 7%. So they are doing some fairly drastic things with their assumptions here. This is from January 2006. You can see the oil price down at the bottom, how that has been lifted in 18 months, and how the OPEC spare capacity has gone down, while at the same time they have reduced demand forecasts. So something pretty bad is happening to non-OPEC supply as well. But they continue to have the view, this is OPEC incremental capacity. The figures are so small, I'll move quickly here. But the bottom line is that they are changing around on the assumptions while the conclusion is the same. Now we come to Sarah. We would have loved to have the opportunity to discuss with them, They were invited to Boston. They were invited here. Peter Jackson, who thinks he debunked peak oil theory, would have been particularly welcome. But I guess by now they realized the 2005 oil supply report was no masterstroke, like their natural gas study and like their power study. So instead of discussing peak oil with us, they published strange and unverifiable things about decline rates. But we should not hold this against Dan Yergin. Great minds have wandered astray before. $640K ought to be enough for anybody. Bill Gates, 1981. I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. Thomas Watson. And finally, there is no reason why anybody would want a computer in their home. Ken Olsen, founder of Digital Equipment Corporation. Let's have a look at the global sterile liquids outlook from 2005 and the revised version in 2006. Here we see the changes in 15 months. From May 2005 to 2006, you can see that in the near years, they have reduced their expectations quite considerably through 2007. But then some miracle happens, and by 2010, they're actually above what they thought in 2005. I mean, the growth rate that you have to have in supply between 2008 and 2010 must be staggering. Now, if you compare this with IEA's expectations, you're talking about close to 7 million barrels a day. No wonder they haven't made an update in 2007. Now, do you remember why we were told we should have such faith in Sarah's numbers, according to Sarah? Well, you see, they have this database, which is so fantastic, which is so detailed, which makes all their figures and predictions so reliable. So let's have a look how good this database is. Norway must be one of the easiest countries in the world to monitor. They drown you in statistics on a field-by-field basis on a monthly basis. If you don't get it right there, it is because something is happening which you don't understand, like Norsk Hydro admitted, and it has nothing to do with your fantastic database. So let's see how correct they were on the Norwegian continental shelf. Originally in May 2005, these were the figures they operated with. By August 2006, they had changed, revised down wisely through 2006, but then again, like Lazarus in 2010, they are above their original figure. Now, if you compare that with the IEA's latest expectations, they have their 5-year report as well, you see now that Sarah is considerably above the IEA. In 2010, for Sarah to be right, production must actually be 43% above what the IEA expects. I say again, 43% more. If you are that far off in Norway, where data is so nicely laid out for you, why on earth should we listen to what you are saying about Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, where data quality may be less impressive? What is really the true value of that database for the purpose they claim they are using it? Now I'd like to go on to the final leap. There's only 3 years left until we are in 2010. And we have quite a lot of different views on how the world will look in 2010. And the interesting thing is to see the difference in views. If you look at demand, the IEA is on the top with close to 92 million barrels a day, and CGES is actually at the bottom of 87. And if you compare it with the IEA 2007, they only have 1 million barrels to go. So the difference between the top and the bottom is actually 5 million barrels a day. Non-OPEC supply. Sarah is again on the top and Simmons at the bottom. This was from a very interesting study this summer, a very detailed non-OPEC study. As you can see, according to Simmons, the IEA, the non-OPEC has now peaked and we will see a lower figure in 2010. But this difference between the top and the bottom is now 7 million barrels a day. Global capacity, Sarah on top with 102 million barrels. Goldman at 93 is at the bottom. So that's 9 million barrels a day in difference in just, it's 3 years. I mean, we're soon in 2008. And look here at the call on OPEC, with Simmons at the top with 35 and OPEC understandably at the bottom with 30. Now, a 5 million barrels a day swing in call on OPEC will have a dramatic impact on the market. And then finally at spare capacity, OPEC says 8 million barrels a day, CGES 6.3, IEA 3.2, and Goldman at 1.9. That's a 6 million barrels a day difference. Why do I have question marks on Simmons? Because Simmons do not have an official OPEC estimate for 2010. But they do have some nice matrices for where you can move around on decline rates and contract and project slippage. And having talked to the people, since I know them well, a fair figure would maybe around 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day. But that is not an official figure. But this is, again, not the real spare capacity. This is the la-la spare capacity, including what you can produce in Iraq and the heavy oil nobody wants to buy. So you can see that the spare capacity situation will be negative in many of these cases. So there is an enormous gap, which cannot be a question of data or the battery in your calculator. The difference must be embedded in ideology and theory about where oil price ought to be. You sort of start with the conclusion and work your way backwards from there. I think it can be quite fun to follow month by month as we approach 2010 who will be the closest to the mark, or actually whose theory is right. I have my favorites, but maybe we can all make bets and let ASPO be the bookmaker. Now, that's a new business idea for ASPO on your website. Being bookmaker is supposed to be very profitable. Your profits could maybe finance ASPO's work. So here's a business idea. Thank you all for the opportunity to come and address you.